RealTalk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
The hour where the U.S. mission to the African Union comes to you through Afro FM 105.3 to highlight the United States partnership in Africa. Current issues will be discussed. Guests will engage on a variety of topics ranging from politics to jazz. Co-hosted by AUL Solomon of Afro FM and Chris Meade of USAU. The show will air every Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. Feel free to participate by sending messages to the USAU social media sites www.usau.usmission.gov or www.facebook.com/USAU and follow USAU on twitter.com/USAU.
Just relax. Welcome to my house.
Real Talk USA.
Welcome to my house. It's my house.
Hey everyone, this is our weekly show, RealTalk USA on 105.3 FM, and it's me, AUL Solomon, with
Mazgawa Tadasa. Good afternoon, everybody, and happy World Press Freedom Day today.
Yes, it's our day today.
It is our day today. And we have a very special program for you. We are going to transmit a web chat around World Press Freedom Day featuring media experts discussing disinformation and media literacy. So enjoy.
Enjoy.
Before we go any further, I want to apologize for the sound quality because the web chat obviously is over the internet, and we might have some interruptions and sound problems. We hope you will endure through and listen to the entire show. We also apologize that we have missed a few minutes at the beginning trying to get connected to the chat. Enjoy.
Number 4. Where does the story get its support? Does the article link to or reference any research? Frequently using the words "research says" without disclosing it is a major red flag. Number 5. Consider your own bias. It's possible you feel strongly about an article or headline because it confirms your own opinions. Do your best to consider the facts objectively. Next time you scroll your newsfeed, remember these tips and do your own digging.
All right, Jennifer, can you start us off by sharing some of your thoughts on media literacy and what students and educators can do to be aware of disinformation and seek out credible news sources?
Yes, thank you, Jesse, and I'm just so excited to be here for this World Press Freedom Day and to talk about some of these very important topics that are dire for us around the world right now. But right now, I think with the influx of social media, media literacy is more important now, more than ever. And so when we speak about media literacy, of course, we talk about understanding the forms of media and then what the messages are that might be behind them. And then, of course, media, we look at there being different forms of media, about 8 forms of media, with books being the oldest and the internet being the newest. And the internet dominates all other forms, and that's what we call convergence. So it's so important now because with everything being available online, that means that we have content creators. Anyone who has access to a keyboard, a laptop, a phone can be a content creator, which is great because we all have access, right? But then the downfall is with that, we don't know necessarily who the sources are of that information. And that leads us to those issues of fake news that the video was so great in describing. So when we talk about media literacy, we have to make sure that we as consumers of this information understand where this information is coming from and how to tell whether or not it's real. And then that leads me to what we as professors and educators must do to make sure that students recognize and understand these things. And I think just in 30 seconds or less that we as professors must turn to the basic tenets of journalism and then provide historical and current examples. So we must teach students to understand how journalism is part of the fabric of society and how we are part of the democracy of America, and that is our main goal as journalists. And then understand the historical references that we've had to America. And once we do that and use current and past examples, then we get the students engaged and being proud of what their role is, which is a very impactful and important role. And of course, there's much more to say, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much. Geysha, can we hear from you?
Yes, of course. And thank you so much for having me here for today's discussion. Disinformation is it's important to understand what it is versus misinformation. I know that we've gone back and forth between the two terms. Misinformation is the unintentional spread of false information. This is a common mistake that happens with legitimate news sources and outlets. The difference between legitimate sources and illegitimate sources is that they admit their mistakes. If they unintentionally spread a piece of false information, they report it, they let you know, and they make the audiences aware. Disinformation, however, is the use of false information to manipulate, to really get at the target audience in order to make them either feel a certain way or choose a certain topic over another. And disinformation campaigns are so effective more today than they were before because of social media. Social media makes it easier for state and non-state actors to target audiences, to appeal to their emotions. I call this the Big Mac theory. Disinformation is a lot like burgers. They're juicy, delicious, you want them, you crave them, and you consume them, mainly because they reaffirm your own beliefs. And in order to address this information, what we're doing is fighting it with facts. So broccoli. This is not a real strong, effective way in order to fight disinformation. That is why, while media literacy is important, more needs to be done. It is not the only option. So we have civic education. Understanding your own history makes you less susceptible to being deceived. Independent journalism. It is important not to just invest in independent journalism, not just reading the articles, but actually monetarily investing. Investing actually makes sure that the publications remain above water and that they are able to distribute further. And then fact-checking. In Brazil, you have Alfatos. In Europe, you have EU versus disinfo, and so on and so forth. And I can continue listing all the very important tools that we have. But media literacy, definitely important, but there are a lot more tools in that toolbox that need to be used.
Thank you. Anthony, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, thank you so much for having me and letting me join you today. I live in Washington, D.C., but I'm calling in from Maryville, Missouri. And I think that it's a great place for me to be as I think about today's topic, because we have a crisis of trust happening right now. We don't know what information to trust, what information's misinformation, disinformation, true, false. And I think it's especially true when we look at communities like Maryville, where I am today. The originators of information, whether that's large companies, whether that's major media outlets, they are not part necessarily of this community. And people in the communities are suspicious sometimes of information, even if it is true. That's one of the things we have to recognize in today's world. Even if we're telling the truth, people may be suspicious of that information. And so we have to really grapple with that. And even if our news is the truth, we need to make sure we're conveying it and sourcing it and reaching people in the community. And that leads me to another really important piece of research, which is that there's so much data now that tells us people trust information they get from friends, or from people who even feel like them, even though they may not know them personally, than information from sources. And what that means is, if one of your friends shares a piece of fake news from one of the websites we saw earlier, the community is more likely to believe it right away because it came from a trusted source. And that's really important for us to recognize. It means if we want to stop false information, we need to get other people involved. We can't just have an institution tell us that wasn't true. We need the community to buy in and realize it wasn't true. And I think this underlies a major shift we're seeing. There's a great book out called New Power, and it talks about the juxtaposition of old power and new power. And these are phenomena such as a transition from closed source communities and software to open source communities and software. We see crowdsourcing, crowdfunding. I think ultimately it's a great thing that this power is being dispersed and that more groups of people have opportunities to be engaged in society and in the economy. But it also comes with a challenge. It means that that information is coming from many sources. So we have to educate the public, and we have to make sure we have a way to get communities engaged in this so that they are correcting one another. That's a role we each have to play. We each have to stand up, and when we see something posted, we can be the one to comment and say, actually, that's not true. I saw something else. That is one of the key ingredients for us to fight this challenge we have today.
Thank you so much. Now, before we jump into viewer questions from Nairobi and the larger global online audience, let's dig into a poll question we shared on social media in the days leading up to this discussion. We asked, what aspects of media literacy are you most interested in hearing about? You can see the results on the screen. The top answer was social media's role in spreading disinformation and also preventing it at 36% of the responses, followed by strategies for recognizing disinformation or fake news at 28% of the responses, and then how do you develop skills for identifying and challenging disinformation at 17%. Anthony, Jennifer, and Geysha, what are your reactions to this poll? Anthony, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, I was not surprised to see social media was a hot topic and the number one on the poll. It made me think about how fast information is traveling nowadays. April 15th, 1865 is when President Lincoln was shot, and it took 12 days for that information to be published in the Times of London. So almost 2 weeks for some of the biggest news in the world. Today, if the president tweets, in seconds, people around the world know. It is instant. That means information travels instantly because of social media. Both great information, true information, and false information, mis and disinformation. It's really important that we recognize as that information travels, it's not just what the information is, but how it's packaged. And I'll give you a specific example with some work I've been involved with. Fluoride is added to community water supplies to help ensure dental safety, the dental health. But one of the things we've seen is a rise of misinformation and disinformation about fluoride. Now, fluoride in high doses is poisonous, but that doesn't mean that it's poisonous when it's in the water supply. And so this creates this challenge with misinformation, because if you say fluoride is a poison, well, it's true, but in the context of how it's being used in communities, it's false. And this shows us there's a complexity, that not everything is black or white. We need context. When we looked at that conversation, we found there were three key audiences: people who were very anti-fluoride, people who were very pro-fluoride experts, and people in the middle who didn't know. And this is the approach we have to take when we want to combat misinformation and disinformation. Isolate and figure out what communities exist, and then go to them where they are, meet them where they are, and start to educate at that level. It doesn't, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And that, I think, is one of the things we've seen with how powerful social media is in allowing information to travel instantly.
Excellent. And Jennifer, do you want to expand on that a little bit more, add your thoughts to the conversation?
Sure. So I remember in the early 2000s, before we had this big, huge boom of everyone being on social media, there used to be a time when people would send emails and say, did you see this story? There's a face of Osama bin Laden in the clouds. This is real. Or there were all kinds of misinformation or just complete fake information that was going out. And at the time I was at CNN, and I would get all of these emails, and I would always respond by one question, which is what I say now and what I say in class, and that is, consider the source. So with social media, as I said earlier, everyone can be on social media, and in a nanosecond, that information is spread. So what do? And one of the sites back then that was very popular, that still is Snopes. And I would send a link, I would type a few keywords, and then I would send it back and say, please share this with your groups. So to piggyback what Anthony was saying, we have to make sure that when we see this mis or disinformation that we stop it. Now, it's hard to identify it because a lot of times people their whole goal is to see if I can fool the media. So in turning back to the journalism side, there are many examples where we see something that is just a mistake, such as back in January in Hawaii when a worker mistakenly sent something out saying that, we're under an imminent attack. Okay, that sent moral panic, and that's what happens when these things take place. But then you have just last week, I think it was, in Canada, in Winnipeg, where a person behind a computer sent out a false alarm that a nuclear attack was imminent, and it caused moral panic. And then police were able to track him down at his house. So there's a difference now because with social media and with everyone having a computer, people are becoming more savvy with skills to misinform and to see if they can get away from it. We see numerous examples of misinformation that went out during the presidential campaigns for both sides that many people believed and many people still believe. So it affects policy, it affects the democracy, and we have to be very careful with how we approach that. In journalism, we have very strict verification processes that we use. And now I think consumers have to kind of go back to using those same processes as well.
Excellent. Yes, and one of the things we encourage our students is to always question what's the source of their information. At NewsEmed, we ask them to use that tool of who's this creator? Now, Geysha, I want to hear quickly from you before we start turning to our online and viewing groups.
Yeah, of course. So there was research earlier this year by MIT that found that people searching online were 6 times more likely to click on an article that was fake news or labeled as fake news over something that was true. And this is just representative of how much information is being thrown out at us. So social media has made it so that our news feeds are constantly being uploaded with new information, constantly hitting at us. And so our attention has become a commodity, and that commodity is for sale. And with that comes a lot of the different business models that have made it so that social media platforms are selling our attention. That comes in different ways. For example, algotransparency.org found that on YouTube, even a neutral search would lead you to more radical results. For example, if I search, is the earth flat? Then I would get intense art videos that would say, yes, the earth is flat, and here are all the different examples of how it is flat. And that is representative about attention. If you find something that is more controversial, you're likely to be on that page longer. And that means more ad revenue, which means more money for the social media platforms. Now, that is shifting a little bit with the election interference that has occurred not only in the United States but in Europe and now expanding throughout the world. We see that social media platforms are taking a more responsibility about how they conduct their business models. A lot of it has to do with transparency, revealing this information to the public. But again, it has to do with our attention. It's a business model, and so shifting that and really pushing for that is I think key. And just one more thing, as social media platforms become the #1 source for a lot of people to get their news, this also represents a challenge because it is harder to tell whether or not something is true or not, and this is part of a wider epidemic.
Well, thank you. We will now turn to the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, where they have an assembled group participating in this program. Hello, Nairobi, and hello, Ambassador Godek.
Hello. A very big hello, very big hamjambo from Nairobi, Kenya. It is wonderful to join all of you back in Washington in the United States. We have a terrific group of Kenyans here today, educators, students, journalists, all of them very interested, I know, in in the subject that you all are discussing. And it is a very important subject for Kenya. It's an important subject for the world. You know, freedom of the media, freedom of expression are critically important, and they certainly played a huge role in Kenya's growth as a country. They're really essential, I think, for a stable, strong, vibrant democracy. And I know the Kenyan people are very much committed to their rights, which are enshrined in their 2010 constitution. But there have been big challenges here, particularly around last year's election, with fake news, misinformation, disinformation. All of these have presented huge challenges. There's a very vibrant media, more traditional media here, but there's also a very rapidly growing and very important social media presence. So here you see Facebook having a big role, and even more so a service like WhatsApp, where a lot of Kenyans do get their news and information. And last year, during a very extended and contentious election period, Kenyans received a lot of information over social media, and a lot of it, or too much of it, was fake. It was things like a fake CNN broadcast, a fake BBC broadcast, a fake U.S. Embassy cable, and so much more. And many of the claims and statements made and some of the things that were circulating stoked ethnic tension, really even encouraged violence in some instances, and it's extremely dangerous. Obviously, these things can fundamentally undermine democracy. So it's critically important that as citizens, all of us, wherever we are, understand the risks and threat that come from this disinformation and misinformation. It can pose a huge problem. Here at the embassy, in recent weeks, we've started a campaign or an effort to help Kenyans better understand the risks of fake information, disinformation. Started a campaign called hashtag Stop, Reflect, Verify, and then hashtag Yali Checks. Both of them are intended to help provide Kenyans with some of the tools and methods that they can themselves identify when there's fake information circulating. And it's some of the tips that you all have already given, but I think there's a lot of discussion needed about this. It is fundamentally a threat, I think, to our societies, and it does risk violence, and it does create issues when there is a tsunami, a huge wave of disinformation, particularly around elections. And so I'm very, very pleased that this is happening today. I'm very pleased that this really extraordinary audience of Kenyans has joined the discussion. I think there's a lot that we can do together as citizens, as educators, as students, as journalists, as people, to help ensure that we're getting the best possible information and therefore making the best possible decisions for our own future, for our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's start. Do you have a question for the panelists?
Hi, my name is Anita, and my question is regarding the legality aspect in fake news. There are actually bloggers who may or may not have gone to media school and understood the dynamics, but they are thriving on fake news because the controversy sells. So they have a habit of having half truths, half lies. So most times you're really glued, so you don't know today it's true, tomorrow it's not true. So when they perhaps touch on the government, they will get caught. And but now the issue of legality comes in because of human rights. Again, you cannot just come and get this guy. So my question is there a country or is there a way to deal with this issue in terms of legality and of course to also protect and preserve the profession? Thank you.
Well, I know here in the United States we have the First Amendment protecting our freedom of the press, and the First Amendment doesn't verify or state that what we publish has to be 100% true. But let's get some thoughts from our panelists about kind of the legality question and how that works and how it can balance with a free press.
Well, when we talk about the free press, we know that here in America, that is, as you mentioned, the foundation for us with the First Amendment. I had the opportunity to speak in Namibia a couple of summers ago about the media's role in fostering good governance in Africa. And so we know that when it comes to journalists and the media working with the government, you need to work together. And that's a problem where we may have somewhat of a problem of that here in the country, but a lot of times here we take press freedom for granted, where in parts of the world, such as Africa and in the East, many parts of the world, the press isn't free. So while we have freedom of press and freedom of speech, that also, to your point, gives anyone the opportunity to publish that information, whether it's true or not. And I guess for us as journalists, we have to be more vigilant in demanding a few things. One, that we can try to hold those people accountable who are doing something if it deals with a legality issue. And then secondly, advocate so that we can point this out effectively online. So if there are there is Jolly checks and these other things that are there to prevent this dissemination of non-truths online, if we can continue to identify it and hold those people accountable, I think we'll start to see a change. But it is very, very hard because people can hide behind that screen.
Did you want to add something, Geysha?
Solutions to disinformation have to be consistent with our values, and that includes freedom of expression and freedom of the press in its different variations throughout the world. However, there are some solutions that can be explored that are still consistent with our values. When you look at Google, Facebook, in terms of how you do your search, if you Google a piece of information, there is a way to de-rank content based on how reliable it is. And for example, if you did search, is the earth flat, you would not get this blogger as the first result on your search bar. Rather, it goes down a few pages, and then you're able to search and get good content on top. That way you're not censoring content, you're not blocking content, you're simply de-ranking based on how legitimate a news source is. And I know that there are options that are being explored currently in Europe, where they're looking at a media index, where they are able to rank different media outlets by how consistent they are with the truth. And so, there are options. I think that would be one of the easiest fixes that the social media networks can do now. And again, we have to be consistent with our values. A lot of these solutions, if we overstep or over-regulate or impose ourselves, then we're not, we risk actually having those tools being used by bad actors that will use that against journalists, for example, and further repress their freedom of expression and freedom of the press.
Excellent. Well, let's go to Nairobi. I want to make sure that we have time for as many questions as possible. So, Nairobi, do you have another question?
Thank you. My name is Nyaga Steven. I'm a graduate from the University of Nairobi. My question is, to what extent the media freedom declined and lost its objectivity due to conflict of interest between professional journalists and the media house proprietors, who are businessmen and some politicians? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn to Anthony for an answer to this question and get your thoughts. Anthony, can we hear from you?
Sure. Well, what I said earlier about this crisis of trust, I think there are challenges, if not in practice, at least in perception from the public, that media outlets have companies paying to advertise with them. This has always existed for a very long time, but we know about it, and also ownership. And I think that that's why some smaller media outlets have become more popular. And when smaller outlets become more popular, we have many sources of information, it makes it harder for us to determine right away which information we can trust and which information we can't trust. We may have an established journalist with a great career who has their own blog, and that's a very trustworthy source. And it's different. It's hard for us to tell the difference between that and a blogger who's actually being paid by companies to post information or being incentivized to share mis or disinformation. So this is a challenge that we face in today's world, which I think really is the result of this transition from old power to new power. I think that fortunately we do have great journalistic institutions that exist that are doing an excellent job. I think we have wonderful information. Sometimes what I fear is that the information that is packaged in really great videos and cartoons and sensational headlines that comes from other outlets catch people's attention more in today's social media world. And just to add a quick point on our last question about the legality, I think this is a shared responsibility. I think the media has a responsibility. I think the government has a responsibility when it comes to regulation. We always hear this example in free speech: you can't walk into a crowded movie theater and yell fire. That's not, you don't have the freedom of speech in that case. And I think when it comes to misinformation, we have to ask, what does that look like? And then most importantly, technology companies such as Facebook and Twitter, they have a level of responsibility, and we're starting to see them voluntarily take steps. The question is whether there may be more regulation. So absolutely, there's a perception issue, but fortunately, we still do have some great journalists, and we have to help the public understand which ones they can trust and do that.
All right, now let's take some questions from the comments section or those following along on Twitter using the hashtag WPFD2018. So the first question we have is, what are the responsibilities for media consumers when sharing news over social media platforms? So I want to turn to Geysha, since you mentioned something about this earlier. Let's turn to you for this one.
Well, this is going to be a difficult one for me to answer, because I actually believe that so much of the responsibility is put on the consumer to be a responsible news consumer, instead of actually looking at, the outlets, the social media platforms, and all of the other mediums in which we consume our information. I think that in particularly looking not at just the social media platforms, but looking at WhatsApp, for example, there's a real challenge in that, if a friend sends you a news article without them checking, whether or not this is a legitimate news source, then you come to the, you don't question. It comes from your friend. It comes from a trusted source. I think that, especially since we're speaking mainly to educators and we're talking to, students, be careful before you share. Do follow the advice of the video. Make sure that you actually are checking the sources. Did this outlet actually appear overnight, or do they have a history of publishing? Do they only follow to one side, or are they more balanced in terms of their reporting? And who is writing? Again, be aware of the bylines. If there's no author, this is likely an illegitimate source.
At Museum Ed, we actually produced a tool for educators and students called Is This Share-Worthy? And it's a flow chart that students and educators and anyone who wants to check whether something should be shared can walk through the steps and get some insight into the process so that they can implement it in their own lives. Now, I want to go to our next online question, where an online viewer asks, can we trust crowdsourced websites like Wikipedia? Are these sites reliable? Jennifer, I want to hear from you on this one.
Sure, that's a great question. Actually, I had the opportunity to sit in on a panel, not be a part of a panel, but sit with someone from Wikipedia, with faculty at Howard University, to talk about how journalists are involved and how they get their information on Wikipedia, and it was really interesting. And what people don't realize is that Wikipedia does get information from various places, but a lot of times those people may be journalists, they may be graduate students, they may be experts in the areas, and Wikipedia actually does have staff, and those people go around and sort of fact check the fact checkers, so that a lot of times, more than not, the information that's coming into Wikipedia is sourced and it's fact. And if you look at the bottom, when something is placed in there, it's added sort of like footnotes for a research paper. So every time a story is updated, you'll see the information at the bottom, where the source came from and when it was updated. This is very useful on stories now that come up, on news-based stories that have happened specifically after some of the recent rioting and protests that have gone on in the country, and they'll put the name of a victim up, and then they'll give the background of that person. So that's an example, and then you can go and see where they get the information from. And what people don't realize a lot of time is that on Wikipedia, a lot of researchers, generally in news, we often say don't use Wikipedia as a source, but you can always go to a site in general and look at the source that they use, and that's part of the verification process. Go to that source and check it out. That person may have written an article, that person may have done a research study. So I feel that in most cases, and from what I've learned, Wikipedia can be reliable. But again, you must consider the source and look and see who's put that information there. But they do try to do a good job with regulating that.
I'm sure it's familiar to many of our educators to check into those citations and dig into that evidence.
You must look at those resources and the citations.
Well, American Center in Lusaka asked, what steps can be taken to promote press freedom? So I feel like this is a question for you, Geysha.
What steps can be taken to promote press freedom? I mean, it is World Press Freedom Day. I think that continuing to highlight the importance of independent journalists from across the world remains a top priority. You have Rappler in the Philippines, you have Hivasa in Kenya, and these are all sources that are, attempting to have a balanced, reporting available for all people. But I think most importantly today, for those that are watching that are able, subscribe to your newspapers that you like and actually pay to see good journalism, because that actually supports not only good information, but it holds governments accountable, it holds businesses accountable, and it is the best way to go. So please, if today you have a moment, do invest in your independent journalism.
Excellent. We have another online question from Said Kaukab. Apologies if I got your name wrong. And they ask, what role has modern communication technologies played in changing politics? Anthony, I want to turn this question over to you.
Well, modern communications has been, it's difficult to describe how transformational when it comes to politics. Certainly, if we look back at the election of President Obama, people said that was really the first social media election. And I think the reason it is it created an opportunity to unleash the energy of supporters so that they could be representatives of the campaign and they could be catalysts and activists for the campaign. We saw that also during the last presidential election, where social media was very important. And of course, the current president communicates directly with the public using social media, using Twitter primarily. So politics has been shaped a lot by social media. Some may think for better, some may think for worse. I think it's generally just part of this new power phenomenon that we are seeing. And some things that we each have to keep in mind that I think are positive in the American construct is that we have the ability to communicate with our legislators and our policymakers like never before. If you send a letter to a member of Congress, they may or may not ever see your actual letter. It probably gets tallied somewhere. If you tweeted a member of Congress, there's a decent chance that they may actually see it because they all use that device, even if they're not actively tweeting, to see who's talking about them, who's mentioning them. And I hear countless stories from my friends on Capitol Hill about how their bosses do pay attention. So it is incredible how we have this power nowadays to communicate with our policymakers and to learn the transparency, to learn what's happening on a daily basis and not just read the summaries. We're going to continue to see this trend. I think we're seeing this trend around the world. And what we have to each do as a responsible citizen is be engaged and think about how we can use this phenomenon to become part of the process, to get our friends and family involved in the process, because that's what we have to do to move things forward.
Oh, yeah. Do we want to add a couple quick thoughts before we head to our next question?
Very quick, because this is, while it is a great avenue and it's a great thing that we're able to participate and be engaged in our politics, it's also a really big opportunity for malign state and non-state actors to actually inject themselves in our political discourse across the world. And of course, we're, the Kremlin's interference in European elections actually jolted a lot of reaction from policymakers in the US and in Europe. But we still have challenges like bots driving content and really making it appear as if an issue is important, as it was the case in Catalan, where you have bots and trolls from Venezuela actually driving discussions in Catalan, making it appear that an issue has more support than it actually has. And then micro-targeting. This makes it very easy, not only for politicians, as we're seeing in Mexico with the different candidates using the social media to really push different issues, but they also allow to push your emotions, to really exploit them and make you either angry or happy about a certain issue that will either get you out to vote or make you stay at home. And we continue to see that, and those are challenges that social media platforms will need to continue to address.
Definitely. I want to go into our next question, which is, Mirand asks, what are some tactics that we can use to determine if the information on a website is true? And I'm familiar with our own tools. We give media consumers a strategy we call Escape, which are 6 tools to help them check and see whether the information they're looking at is real or quality. But I want to turn to you on this one, Jennifer, and see what are some other ways that they can dig into information on websites to see if it's true, since you've mentioned sourcing a lot.
Yes, well, a lot of times you want to, and I think the video is really good, and also the points that the museum uses are really good, but you really want to get to know what that source is. So when you just see a story that pops up on your screen, you go to it, and of course the first thing, look at that URL that was there. Look at the headline that's there. And then read the story. A lot of times, a lot of these sites and some of the fake sites or the satirical sites will get you with that headline. They use SEO tags, which are search engine optimization tags that they may use to get people to draw them into those sites, whether it's through the headline or through some of the content. So take time and read through and look and see who these people are that they're sourcing or that they're quoting. A lot of times the names may be some made-up name, and as you keep going through, you should also check the photos. Now with social media and Photoshop, it's hard to really to be able to kind of maneuver yourself through. But what we would do for journalists, we had a routine where we would have a 3-step process of verification. So if I were reporting on a story, I would check my sources. I turn it into my editor or producer. They would check the source. And then before it goes to air, we have another set of people there who go back through and look. So we have 3-step process. If we're looking at something from home, look and see who the URL is from. Read the article, look to see who they're sourcing, look to see who they're quoting, and then look that person up. We all become journalists in that way, in that, we're digging in and we're seeking truth. So I think if you just take some basic steps as you're starting that process, it'll help you kind of weed out, and you can kind of get in a habit. The more you do it, it just takes practice, you can start kind of filtering through what doesn't seem real. I always say if something sometimes seems too good to be true, it might be. And there's a reason we say sometimes a jaded journalist, because we're always questioning something.
Excellent. So I'm seeing a huge amount of questions coming in, and I know we have so much great information, but I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. So we're going to be getting to as many as we can. I see one from the U.S. Embassy in Kigali. They are asking, is it possible to develop intelligent apps that warn or flag users about potential harm from certain content? Now, Anthony, I'd like to turn this one over to you.
Well, we are seeing different social media platforms experiment with ways to warn consumers, their users, if the information may be disputed or inaccurate. We're also seeing third-party companies and services coming into the market. There's one called NewsGuard that launched recently, and what they're doing also is verifying information. I think it'll be interesting to see what consumers demand, because as we look at the different responsibilities we each have, if consumers demand this, just like we heard before, websites like Snopes, there's a market for that, because consumers want to be able to search and find if something's true. And if consumers demand this from social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, then I think we'll be more likely to see it. So we are seeing some steps move in that direction, but nothing is perfect, and there are so many gray areas when it comes to fact and fiction. Nothing will ever be perfect. We will also have to take some responsibility on ourselves to do our own research, because the way things are phrased or bits of information, we're going to have to be discerning, and that means I applaud all the educators who are part of this today and all the work that the museum does to educate, because we need our educators and our students to understand this so that we can be discerning and informed when we research information. But the social media platforms can help by flagging that.
Excellent. Now, before we go back to our audience in Kenya, I want to ask the panel if they have any recommended online or offline places to go for media literacy tools and advice. Now, I know, of course, my own work, which is at newsiemed.org, but I was wondering if each of our panelists could share maybe their top couple favorite tools or resources they want to share.
Well, a lot of the tools that I use, because I am still a practicing journalist and I teach journalism, a lot of what I do is teach through examples. So I use real life scenarios, and I use that as an opportunity to teach or to learn. So if we're talking about ethics, for example, then we can talk about real life ethical implications that may have come from covering September 11th. I was one of the producers at CNN on that day. So I'll use real case scenarios to teach about what are the best roles and ways to tackle that. And then we may research what other journalists have done. I know at the museum there's that wonderful ethics center where students can play the game and pick out ethical choices and see if it matches up to what they've done. So I like to use real life examples, and also I have my students go to news sources such as CNN, CBS, and look to get some of the historical aspects of how journalism has changed and progressed. So I like to use sort of real life examples to teach journalism, because I say we have all the elements we need right there, and then I bring some of that. I also like to do quiz games. There's some fake news. There's several sites, and I could give specific ones later. But I love doing quiz games where they can try to identify fake news, and then we discuss what's wrong with them, or different social media examples that expose issues with images and examples in that way. But I generally use news that's there in the media now.
I'm sorry to cut this off. This is all the time we have, and but the show continues, and I hope you all have enjoyed it. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Real Talk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
The hour where the U.S. mission to the African Union comes to you through Afro FM 105.3 to highlight the United States partnership in Africa. Current issues will be discussed. Guests will engage on a variety of topics ranging from politics to jazz. Co-hosted by AUL Solomon of Afro FM and Chris Mead of USAU. The show will air every Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. Feel free to participate by sending messages to the USAU social media sites, www.usau.usmission.gov or www.facebook.com/USAU, and follow USAU on twitter.com/USAU.
Just relax. Welcome to my house.
Real Talk USA.
Welcome to my house. It's my house.